welcome for joining me tonight. Most of you already know me. I'm Dr. Deb. I own Serenity. If you're new, for those of you who may or may not know, hormones are one of my favorite topics. I love hormones. I started doing hormone therapy when I was 28 years old. I'm now 59. Started offering it to clients and absolutely love it, kind of geek out on it. So this is a fun topic for me tonight. But we're going to talk about how hormones are truly the messengers of our entire body, whether you're male or female. They are the messengers throughout the whole body. They're typically not the root cause for issues. There's a root cause that typically causes hormones to be disruptive, and then we have to balance them. And sometimes we do that by finding the root cause. Sometimes we do that by supplementing. But tonight, what I really want you guys to take away from tonight's talk is understanding why hormones are reactive and what's really driving the chaos behind the hormones in the first place. So we're going to talk about why hormones get off balance, the stress and inflammation that cause hormones to be disruptive, and then what we call receptor sensitivity. So those are our big topics that we're going to cover tonight. So before we begin, I'll do our typical. This is for educational purposes only, doesn't constitute personal medical advice because I may or may not be your practitioner and we're not in a practitioner setting. All of our statements and language can be for educational purposes only. If I give you dosages, it's all meant as examples. And not every treatment we talk about tonight is going to be considered FDA approved. So we'll start with that good old language to protect ourselves there. So a lot of times this is what we hear from clients is my labs were done. They didn't find anything abnormal, but I still don't feel right. Whether we're talking about hormones or other things, this is a common scenario. And it's not what we're necessarily imagining, but you're not alone because the normal ranges for labs are so wide, whether we're talking about hormones or iron levels or thyroid levels or nutrient levels. The range is so wide that you could either be on the low end of the normal range or at the very high end of the normal range. And at either place, you could still be considered normal. And the normal values are set out to capture about 90% of the population. However, the normal lab values were determined based on a sick population of people, not on an optimized population of people. So even though we're capturing 90% of them, 90% of sick people are still 90% of sick people. And so when we're looking at hormone labs, we want to optimize them for age, for gender, for where you are in your cycle, for where you are in life. And so that can be the difference behind a doctor telling you your labs are totally normal or a functional or integrative doctor looking at them and saying, these are normal, but they're not optimal. And we'll get into what that looks like tonight too. So what if your symptoms aren't as random as we think they are, but they're actually a coordinated distress signal? Brain fog, fatigue. It may not just be you being tired because you didn't sleep well, or you overworked yourself, or you've been burning the candle at both ends for too long. It may be because your cell structure, what we call mitochondria, is actually starving. It's starving for fuel, it's starving for energy, and therefore that's causing the brain fog and the fatigue. And what if the weight that just doesn't move as we get older and we get further into menopause isn't the calories in, calories out old story? What if it's more of a cortisol and insulin story? And as we get older and our cortisol levels shift based on stress levels and our insulin and blood sugar levels shift because we're older and our body systems just aren't working as well, what if that's actually what's causing the weight gain? And then we certainly have mood, anxiety, and sleep issues. And what if this was coming from progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, GABA, and all of these things were really interconnected. And they're what's making us moody and anxious and not a serotonin deficiency, not an SSRI deficiency, but truly coming because of something that we can fix. And this is what's so important when we're talking about hormones. They react in what we call an upstream fashion. So just because one hormone's abnormal doesn't mean it's the hormone by itself that's abnormal. There could be other intermingled things that are causing the hormones to be disruptive as well. And we'll talk about what a few of those things are that can cause the hormones to be thrown off as well. So I want you to meet your messengers. So hormones are chemical messengers. They're produced by our endocrine system. They travel through the bloodstream and they tell nearly every cell in your body what to do. All of the hormones start from the same place. They all start from the brain and they work their way down. Hypothalamus, pituitary, they're kind of like the divas of the hormone world in the top of our brain. Then we have our glands, and then we actually have our target. And so if we look at different glands, they all produce different hormones. So the adrenal glands produce cortisol, DHEA, and adrenaline. The thyroid gland produces T1, T2, T3, T4, and this is what produces your metabolism and your energy regulation. And then we have the ovaries and the testes, and they are the ones that produce estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, unless they become removed. Once they become removed, then the adrenal glands will try to produce some of these hormones on their own, especially the male hormones or the androgen hormones, so your DHEA and your testosterone. And then we have your pancreas, which is producing insulin and blood sugar. The pituitary is known as the master gland. It controls everything. And it's what kind of sends all those signals downstream for us. And the hypothalamus reads the body's environment and signals what to do. So if the hypothalamus gets thrown off or the pituitary gets thrown off because of a traumatic brain injury, or maybe there's a tumor in the pituitary, it's going to throw off all of the hormones together. And the fun key fact is that the body produces well over 50 different hormones, and they're all in constant conversation with each other at the exact same time. So imagine having a conversation with 50 people at one time, and everyone's talking and everyone's asking questions, everyone's signaling you, and you're the main person that has to control the whole conversation. It gets a little overwhelming sometimes. And when you think about it that way, you can really understand how at times these hormones can get thrown off, because if that's the conversation that's happening, it's easy for there to be disruption and dysfunction from time to time. So stress is the boss for all of us. It controls what we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And so when the body is feeling stress, or it's chronically activated in stress mode, it shuts down that signal to the thyroid, to the ovaries, to the testes. And this is why stress alone can cause so much chaos with hormones and with or without a gland disease. So whether there's an adrenal gland or a thyroid gland, it doesn't matter. If the gland doesn't have a disease, it could still be sending the wrong signals when the body is really stressed out. The body can't tell the difference between good stress and bad stress. If you've heard me speak before on this, I use that analogy a lot. You could be planning a funeral or planning a wedding. It doesn't really matter anymore. Stress is stress. And that can be a really difficult time for people. And the more the body feels like it's under threat from the brain or the body, the more it's going to affect the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is then going to signal the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is going to release ACTH, activation hormone, which is then going to signal your adrenal glands to produce cortisol, DHEA, and adrenaline, that fight or flight response. So car pulls out in front of you, you slam on your brakes, your body gets heightened. You have a cortisol response, you have a stress response. You kind of take a deep breath, you look around, everybody's okay, you go on your way. But if the body's constantly getting hit with those types of stressors, then it affects everything else because the body's just constantly under assault. And when it's like that, it starts to affect the whole body, the immune system, the thyroid, the sex hormones. Everything begins to shift. And it's when those shifts start to happen that we start to see that disruption in the hormonal cascade itself. So if cortisol is the master disruptor, when cortisol stays elevated, it creates a cascade through every hormonal system. So cortisol blocks our ability to convert thyroid hormone from T4 to T3. So think of T4 hormone as the thyroid hormone that circulates in the bloodstream. T3 is what's available for your cells to actually utilize. So if we can't make that conversion and all that thyroid hormone is pooling up in the bloodstream, but it's not active for your cells to use, then you have a thyroid disruption issue. And this is where they talk about a T3 issue, or some people call it Wilson's disease. And it's where your body's just not making enough active T3. So you're going to see things like fatigue, weight gain, hold intolerance, brain fog. Everything kind of just gets sluggish and slows down. Then we can have the sex hormone theft. So we call this a pregnenolone steal, where the adrenals rob the building blocks of the estrogen and testosterone, primarily from pregnenolone. So if we're stealing all the pregnenolone to control the cortisol, then the body can't make estrogen and testosterone the way it's supposed to, and it can't make progesterone either. So it becomes this big problem. If pregnenolone is too low and we're not supplementing with it, you may have to supplement with more estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone to balance that whole cascade out and get your symptoms to subside. When we have insulin resistance, that occurs when cortisol raises the blood sugar. So too much cortisol causes too high of a blood sugar, and that starts to cause the fuel for that fight or flight response. And chronically, when this happens, the body will become more and more resistant to insulin. So when we eat, the pancreas has to create insulin to manage the blood sugar and control how the body is distributing that blood sugar. And everything we eat has to turn to sugar so the brain can utilize it. But if my body is sensing that I have too much sugar, I have to make a lot of insulin to control that. Over time, the body can make too much insulin to the point where that signal becomes a little deafened. It can't hear it as well. And when it can't hear the signal as well, then you become insulin resistant. So the body senses that it's making insulin. It doesn't sense that it's making enough insulin. So it keeps producing more insulin. And the more insulin it produces, the harder the body works and the quieter the message gets. And so it's producing more insulin to bring the blood sugar down, but it's now doing that inefficiently. The insulin stays high, and then we have more weight gain. And especially the weight gain around the midsection is what we're going to see with an insulin resistance issue. And then cortisol can also cause gut permeability issues. It breaks down the gut lining, and it triggers systemic inflammation and immune activation. So too much cortisol is not a good thing. Too little cortisol is not a good thing. And these days, whenever there's an inflammatory process, conventional medicine tends to give cortisol. It gives prednisone as the means to calm everything down. But if we do that too often, we can see the cascade of things that are going to cause problems here: the thyroid, the insulin, the estrogen, the testosterone, and now the gut dysregulation. But if people have a lot of gut issues, like say they have Crohn's or they have ulcerative colitis, one of the ways they treat that is by giving low-dose steroids. And they give those low-dose steroids to reduce the inflammation in the gut lining to help it heal. But then when you come off the steroids, if you didn't fix the problem, the gut lining is still bad. And if the gut lining is still bad, it's going to trigger more systemic inflammation and more immune issues, because 80% of the immune receptors are in the gut. And so when we quiet that with prednisone, we just keep creating this vicious cycle. So we don't want too much of that prednisone. Prednisone actually is a cortisone. It's a hydrocortisone, more of a systemic synthetic form, and it's very potent compared to the cortisol that your body makes, and even more potent than what we would see like a natural hydrocortisone would be. So there's 5 reasons that hormones get thrown off. First and foremost is the chronic stress and the HPA dysregulation. The elevated cortisol depleting that progesterone, which suppresses the thyroid conversion. So when we're dealing with these kinds of things, and especially if people's hormones are always wonky and they're always all over the place and we can't seem to stabilize them, we have to think about the chronic stress levels and the HPA axis. And if we don't fix the cortisol and the chronic stress and support that HPA axis, we're going to have wonky hormones all the time going all over the place. So sometimes we'll actually give product called HPPT, And it's a glandular for the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And it feeds that system to calm the chronic stress down, to calm the cortisol down so the body can start making hormones a little bit better by itself. Second is that leaky gut, that gut dysbiosis. We call the estrobolome the gut bacteria that metabolizes estrogen and breaks it down and causes it to recirculate. If we've got a leaky gut and it's not metabolizing estrogen properly, and we're just constantly recirculating it and we're giving people estrogen, we can create too much of a good thing. And too much of a good thing is no different than too much of a bad thing. And so we want to make sure that gut lining is functioning properly, or we have to just be more cautious with what we're doing with the hormones. Toxic exposures are always a problem. These are your xenoestrogens. These are your phthalates, your BPAs, your heavy metals, your plastics, the real soft plastics, your cleaning products. These are all what we call endocrine disruptors. And these endocrine disruptors become toxic and they cause a problem with the hormonal system. And one of the first places you'll see that is typically thyroid. We will also see this quite often in people with breast cancer, where they've had some kind of toxic exposure. Maybe their genetic makeup just doesn't allow for them to excrete out these bad chemicals, these xenoestrogens, and they build up in the breast tissue and they become stronger than your regular estrogen and progesterone. And you can become estrogen, progesterone receptor positive cancer as a result of some of these things if the body's immune system's too busy clearing these and not clearing the actual cancer cells. The fourth thing is nutrient deficiencies. So magnesium, zinc, B6, D3, iodine, all required for manufacturing hormones and metabolizing hormones properly. Without the right amounts of these things, we're going to have problems with that ability to make them and the ability to excrete them. And then the fifth issue is that chronic inflammation and chronic infection. So chronic inflammation creates something called cytokines, which are inflammatory proteins, and they directly suppress the pituitary signaling and the receptor function. So it's not unusual for us to see people who have Lyme disease have more hormonal disruption. It's not unusual for us to see young women in their 30s and 40s with Lyme disease go into early menopause. Sometimes it's a permanent thing. The ovaries just shut down as a result of the infection. Sometimes it's a temporary thing. The body's trying to preserve itself, and so it shuts down the ability for pregnancy to occur. And then once the insult is gone and the infection is gone, the ovaries can wake up again and then they can work properly. It's not always the case, but it does happen sometimes. So that chronic inflammation, that fueling of that inflammation is really hard on the hormonal system. Inflammation is also known as the silent hormone hijacker. So much like what I just explained, it's those inflammatory cytokines that we look at called IL-6 and TNF alpha. These directly suppress the pituitary gland. They reduce the LH and FSH signal to the gonads, to the ovaries or the testes. It doesn't matter. And then we have something called NF-kappa B. This upregulates what we call aromatase. So this enzyme converts testosterone to estrogen in both men and women. And if NF-kappa B activation is off, it's not unusual for us to see lower testosterone levels in men and higher estrogen levels in men. And we can see this on both sides of the fence for women and men, but primarily the biggest place or the most obvious place you're going to see that is in men, where they're converting their testosterone to too much estrogen. When we have that low-grade chronic inflammation, this impairs your production of progesterone and its receptor sensitivity. And this is one of the major drivers of estrogen dominance. So you can have estrogen dominance simply because you don't make enough estrogen compared to what you're doing with progesterone, or you can have too much estrogen, not enough progesterone, and that can also make you estrogen dominant. And when you're estrogen dominant, you're going to have a lot more weight gain around that midsection as well. And then we have what we call gut-derived LPS, lipopolysaccharide, sorry. This crosses into circulation and triggers the immune hormonal cascade. Dr. Karazian's research links this back to Hashimoto's. And so people with Hashimoto's can have this LPS in their gut and cause a whole cascade of immune-driven hormonal issues. We've often seen women develop hormone allergies, hormone sensitivities to their own, or allergies and sensitivities to their own hormones that their body produces. You'll predominantly see this in people with really severe PMS. When they've had really severe PMS, most of the time, the underlying cause is either going to be endometriosis or it's going to be that hormone sensitivity where you've developed an allergic reaction to your hormones. And that is treatable, but there's only 3 of us in the country that actually do that. And a lot they think comes from the gut brain dysfunction that you have and that gut barrier just being leaky and not being able to function properly. So there's nutrients that your hormones that your body needs to produce the hormones, right? Magnesium is key. It activates 300 plus enzymes. It's critical for cortisol regulation, for sleep, and for progesterone production. They claim that about 80% of the population is magnesium deficient, which I would agree with. Easy to fix, easy to take. Make sure you don't take a citrate form. That's just going to make you poop. That's like mag citrate. You want a malate, a glycinate, or a threonate. And if you're headache prone, do the threonate, because it's much better on headaches than any of the other. If you have muscle issues, do the malate form, but this is really essential for a lot of functions, but hormones specifically. Zinc is required for testosterone synthesis. For the body to make testosterone and utilize testosterone, we need zinc. So when men are deficient in zinc, in testosterone, oftentimes we'll say, take 30 to 50 milligrams of zinc, and that'll help raise your testosterone level. It also helps to make estrogen and progesterone support and estrogen receptors. So zinc is really crucial for making all of those hormones. Vitamin D3 is actually a hormone. It's not a vitamin. It's a precursor that modulates estrogen, testosterone, and our thyroid receptors. So vitamin D is very important for hormonal function. And then we have B6. B6 is a cofactor for neurotransmitters and progesterone production. It gets depleted by oral contraceptives and many other medications. And when that happens, then those neurotransmitters can decline, as can progesterone production decline. Yeah. Iodine and selenium are essential for thyroid hormones, for T4 and T3 conversion. So if you don't have enough iodine and selenium, you might have plenty of T4, but not enough T3. And when we don't have enough T3, we don't have enough active hormones. So we still might look great on paper, but we still feel bad. We're still fatigued. We still have brain fog. We're still sluggish, all of those kinds of things. And then your omega-3 fatty acids are really important for reducing the inflammation, reduce those cytokine levels that suppress the pituitary signaling, and actually improve the receptors. So the communication between the pituitary, the hypothalamus, and the rest of the organs so they can function better. So our gut hormone connection, this is where a lot of doctors miss this. So a subset of gut bacteria specifically responsible for producing the hormones. This is when a dysbiotic gut or bad bacteria.
Yeah, I'm going off.
Bacteria can cause what we call beta glucuronidase enzymes to reactivate used estrogens. So recirculating that estrogen. It also can deconjugate estrogen and have it re-enter the bloodstream. And again, reactivate it, reuse it. It can also create estrogen dominance, even within normal levels of estrogen. So your estrogen levels can look normal from where they are in the menstrual cycle, but because we're recirculating these hormones, it can look as though you have too much estrogen. So some of the signs that your hormones are disrupted with gut issues is bloating before your period, constipation, slowing that estrogen clearance, especially constipation during the menstrual cycle. Obvious history of lots of antibiotic use is going to cause that gut flora to be disrupted. SIBO, SIFO, IBS diagnosis, that is going to cause those hormones to be disruptive as well. Premenstrual acne or breast tenderness is another sign that we have too much estrogen, not enough progesterone, so that estrogen dominance. And then PMS that worsens year after year after year. The older we get, is another indicator that we have too high of that estrogen level there. All right, so let's think about our own bodies for just a moment. How would you rate your stress level over the last 2 years? And you don't have to tell us, but if you want to share it in the Q&A, that's fine, or maybe write it down and just think about for a moment what that stress level was like. Have you had a death in the family, a marriage, work trauma, life trauma, fighting about different political things, whatever it is, it could be a stressor, or maybe it's something you do every single day that doesn't feel like a stressor anymore because you're just used to it. But when you sit back and think about it, it's like, yeah, this actually does cause me some stress. I've just gotten used to it and learned how to compartmentalize it. If you have digestive symptoms that you've never connected to your hormones, that would be another sign of things, right? So SIBO, SIFO, IBS, but maybe you're having more PMS, you're having more intense hot flashes, more intense issues with testosterone. These things can all make a big difference for people. And then if you've tested nutrient levels and not just TSH, if we're not looking at iron, we're not looking at selenium, we're not looking at those things, at least on an annual basis, we want to look at those with thyroid function because it can tell us whether or not our thyroid is off. So sometimes even us seeing a little shift in that thyroid and we know somebody has an iron issue, we may go back and look at iron levels and see what's happening so that we know, like, okay, the iron's off and that's what's throwing the thyroid off. So we're not always just increasing or decreasing the thyroid. We're actually looking at some of those nutrient levels that are an issue as well. So with hormones, we talk about hormones being like a lock and key problem. You have to have the key to unlock the door to get open and get things in and get the full picture of what's happening with the hormones. So think about sending a text message, but the recipient of the phone's on the airplane, or they have their phone on airplane mode, and the message wasn't sent perfectly. So the phone just can't receive it. And that's receptor insensitivity. The body's making the hormones, it's sending the signals, but the body's just not quite answering it the way it should. That's our receptor insensitive messages there. So this is where we'll see hormone levels that look pretty normal. You have adequate estrogen, adequate progesterone, but you still may be having all the symptoms of estrogen deficiency or thyroid deficiency. This could be what's actually happening. And when we talk about there being a receptor issue, this is exactly what we mean. So if the receptors downregulate, so chronic overexposure to environmental estrogens, synthetic hormones, your own hormones, this can reduce the estrogen receptors over time. And that signal gets confused and it can't remember things anymore. And then, of course, you have the inflammation that's blocking it. So the cytokines physically alter your receptor structure. And that also then reduces the hormonal signal and the transmission of the messages of what the hormone's doing. And that's why you'll still see some symptoms, even though everything may look fine on the outside. And then, of course, our nutrient cofactors that are required too. If any of these are off, even slightly, they can make a big difference on how the body sees the signal from the hormones themselves. So let's talk for a little bit about what actually damages the hormone receptors in the first place. Well, we talked about chronic cortisol levels, chronic stressors, estrogen, xenoestrogens, environmental estrogens, cleaning products, bathing products, lotions, potions, all of that stuff. We talked a little bit about insulin resistance as well. This can drive what's called PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome in women, where the body's making more testosterone. It's more sensitive to that receptor message. And they create all these little round follicles around the ovaries, or they'll call them cysts. And they're actually fluid-filled sacs that contain eggs, but none of them become mature. And you just have a whole bunch of them there. That's what PCOS is. And so you never ovulate those eggs, and then you don't get a traditional period, and your period might take 2, 3, 4 months to come. And then we have the heavy metal accumulation. So mercury, lead, cadmium, these all compete with zinc and magnesium in the binding sites. And so we get heavy metals from our water, our soil, the air that we breathe, tests that we have done. Any of these kind of metals can be present in our bodies, disrupting us without us even really knowing it. Some of the metals we actually get from vaccines. Aluminum is a big one. Mercury is another. All the vaccines are contaminated with both of them. In a lot of the viral vaccines like shingles and COVID and things like that, they use aluminum to hold that virus in the body longer so that it sticks around for that long 10-year period of time so that it protects you. But at the end of the day, you're getting so much aluminum that we're now starting to see research that shows that this increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. as a result. We also have that systemic inflammation, that TNF alpha, that IL-1B. These are gene receptors that express and reduce signaling differently. And if there's chronic inflammation and the TNF alpha is always elevated, those signals to the body for hormones and for our nutrients can get thrown off because all they're focusing on is trying to quiet the inflammation, but not doing a great job at it. And so it's creating other issues on the backside of it. And then, like we talked about, those nutrients, the magnesium, the zinc, the D3, these are all cofactors. And without them, they can't signal properly. Same thing with certain vitamins. You need B6 with certain cofactors, especially neurotransmitters, for us to absorb them properly, or we don't absorb the neurotransmitters. And then we can't get the serotonin in the way we should. And we have a vicious cycle of things then. So testing and not guessing. For those of you who heard me speak before, I like to do the testing. I think it's important. We need to see what we're dealing with. We can't just assume based on your symptoms. As you can see now, there can be lots of different factors for why the hormones are disrupted in the first place. And these hormones tell different stories. And if we don't have the right story and we give the wrong hormone, we can cause a bigger problem with things. So we don't do total estrogens. We don't do ratios. We do estradiol. Sometimes we'll do estriol and estrone. We don't just do TSH because that misses the conversion. We do T4, T3, TSH, reverse T3, thyroid antibodies. And then from there, we can decide afterwards, what do we want to repeat? But we're always going to repeat at minimum TSH, free T4, and free T3. If the thyroid antibodies have not been abnormal, we don't necessarily repeat them. If the reverse T3 and the T3 are normal, we're not always going to repeat that reverse T3, but we always will do T4, T3, and TSH. You want to look at a basic metabolic panel, a basic CBC, so white blood cell count, red blood cell count, liver, kidney, those kinds of things, because that's going to tell us how your body's clearing a lot of things. And then a random cortisol can be helpful. I like diurnal cortisols, where we look at cortisols first thing in the morning, then at noon, then at supper time, and then at bedtime, because it's telling us the whole story of what's happening throughout the whole day. And you could be high at one point and really low at another point. And then if we just treat that high point and assume you're high all the time, then we're also disrupting everything that's going on in the body. And so we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we're getting that full cascade. And so when we look at doing functional labs, we do estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, you want the sulfated form. That is your free form of DHEA. We don't want it bound to a protein. And then we want a fasting insulin, depending on the story, highly sensitive C-reactive protein, that's for inflammation, ferritin, and then basic micronutrients. And we can go very broad with the micronutrients if we want to. We talked about that 4-point cortisol. In some cases, we will do estrogen metabolites, the 216 hydroxy ratio. This tells us the phase 1 and phase 2 detox, especially if there's a strong family history of breast cancer. We will do this because we want to make sure that your estrogen is going down the proper pathway and it's not creating problems down the road. And then if we're doing blood testing with hormones, we look at something called SHBG. This is sex hormone binding globulin, and it tells us how much your body is binding those hormones to a protein and not being able to utilize them. If we're doing salivary testing, we don't need to do an SHBG because they're already in free form. But if we're doing blood tests, we want to do that SHBG so we can see free versus total and bound to proteins. And then we talked a little bit about this reverse T3 thyroid antibodies. It's called TPO and thyroid globulin antibodies. These tell us if the immune system's attacking the thyroid. And if the immune system is attacking the thyroid, then we want to address that differently than if it's just a sluggish thyroid for no other reason, age and hormones and things like that. So we want to do this layered healing approach when we're looking at adding hormones. We don't just add hormones to add hormones. We rebuild the whole signaling system in the right order. So we want to make sure you've got detox pathways open. We're eliminating properly the gut, the liver, the lymph, the kidneys, all of that is eliminating properly. We'll look at gut repair. If there's a leaky gut issue, then we'll restore that leakiness so that you can tolerate hormones. Sometimes the hormonal symptoms are so strong and it takes so long to treat SIBO and SIFO and IBS that we will go ahead and give hormones while we're dealing with the gut issues. We'll just do it in a more cautious way. We'll use smaller doses, maybe different ratios of things, and monitor them a little bit differently. And then we want to look at those nutrients that we talked about earlier. We want to look at the adrenal stress hormones. So we may look at cortisol. We want to use adaptogenic herbs if there's a lot of stress going on. If there's a lot of stress, we can use things like ashwagandha and magnesium and B vitamins to calm that adrenal system so that your heart rate variability goes down. We can do breath work to calm the nervous system down. All of those things will help calm that nervous system for us. And then we look at hormone optimization, and we only use what's called bioidentical. So these are plant-based hormones. They're made typically from wild yam or soy, and they mimic your own body's natural production of hormones. And so if we want an estrogen molecule, we can make estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, all from the same plant source. They just change the molecular structure a little bit. Your body's going to recognize exactly what that molecular structure is, and it's going to know exactly how to utilize it. We have many different synthetic progestins on the market, very few synthetic estrogens. We've been trying to mimic a natural progesterone in the pharmaceutical world for well over 25 years. They have been unsuccessful to date. They do have a progesterone that you can get from the traditional pharmacy. Women's International sold their formula to Solvay Pharmaceuticals so they could have a natural progesterone because it was so difficult for them to actually get a natural progesterone or as close to that in the synthetic form. So we will look at replacing the hormones that need replacement. Key point here is you are never to take estrogen without progesterone, whether you have a uterus or not. We always want balance between the two hormones. We don't want to be estrogen dominant. We want that balance there. Men should get their hormones checked as well. There are times where we will add a little bit of estrogen or a little bit of progesterone to men, especially if there's erectile dysfunction, if their hormones are really low. Most of the time, you just have to give testosterone, but on rare occasion, giving progesterone can make a big difference for people for that as well. All right, so I want to share a case study with you. So this was a 47-year-old woman who had symptoms of hormonal issues for 10 years. She was told everything was normal. It was just perimenopause. Remember that perimenopause time lasts 7 to 10 years before we hit menopause. So typically we start seeing some of these symptoms occur in women in their late 30s, early 40s, and they can live with this for a very long time before somebody will intervene and say it's hormonal. Prior to that, they're going to say it's anxiety, it's depression, it's stress, it's whatever. She was constantly exhausted by 2 p.m. every day. She was 20 pounds overweight. She had gained that 20 pounds in a 2-year time frame without changing her eating pattern. And she had a pretty clean diet and pretty healthy. She was having anxiety, sleeplessness, hair thinning, and she did 3 different rounds of antidepressant without really any change at all. And so we tested her hormones. It was very obvious to us that there was a hormonal issue. And it revealed estrogen dominance, flat cortisol curve. So she just was flat the whole time with cortisol, low on every aspect. She did have some leaky gut and SIBO. It was confirmed and treated. She was depleted in magnesium, B6, ferritin, and they were all repaired. She lost 16 pounds without counting a single calorie, and her sleep was restored. Her anxiety was gone without any medication at all. And she said she finally felt like herself again for the first time in years. And so you can see how every person can be a little bit different in their scenario of symptoms and actually in what their tests reveal, especially when it comes to cortisol. You can have some people that are completely flatlined. You can have some people that are high all day long and they function well on it, or so we think. And then you can have people that are just up and down. They're all over the place and nothing makes sense there. You can have people with, rarely see them with too much progesterone unless they're supplementing. But I've seen women in their late 50s that have plenty of estrogen, and testosterone and progesterone are the issue for them. And then I have women in their 30s that don't have enough estrogen, don't have enough progesterone, and have plenty of testosterone, but they're still having the same symptoms. And so the symptoms can vary or be the same even though the labs may vary in what they're actually showing us. So what we actually use and why, we have this nutritional protocol that we use. We use a cruciferous compound called DIM as a precursor for estrogen metabolism. So if we need to clear the estrogens, we will use DIM or cruciferous complete that's made by standard process. And then we do seed cycling to support estrogen and progesterone rhythm. So in younger women, what that looks like is we try to mimic the natural menstrual cycle. So we'll give estrogen in the beginning half, progesterone in the second half. In postmenopausal women, there's no reason to do that unless you're trying to gain a cycle back, which is extremely difficult. I will say that. I've tried with many women, gotten way high on the estrogen levels, and they don't like the side effects, and they're still not getting a period. So we tend not to cycle it that way, but we will give them 4 days off a month of their hormones so that their hormone receptors will unflood and they can utilize that hormone better. And then we're not always having to increase the dose of the hormones to get the benefit that they want. And then, of course, elimination of the endocrine disrupting foods. So your processed foods, your plastics, any of the packaged foods, things like that, cleaning supplies. We want to get all of that cleaned out. And then targeted supplements. So we can use DIM and calcium D-glucarate for estrogen detox pathways to be opened. For adaptogenic herbs for the cortisol and the adrenal glands, we use things like ashwagandha, rhodiola, and HPA support. So hypothalamus pituitary support. And then we'll give targeted progesterone with B6. We can use Vitex as an herb to help create some of these hormones like progesterone. And then we can also use magnesium glycinate to help with progesterone as well. And then we talked a little bit about bioidentical hormones already. Transdermal is the most common, it's the most flexible way to give it. If you use a transdermal cream, women and men can raise and lower their doses on a daily basis if they want to. You can do a plant-derived patch that comes from the traditional pharmacy. That's an estradiol only. Some people prefer that. They want to just set it and forget it. That's totally fine. Or you can have that flexibility of a cream. I'm not a pellet fan. I don't like pellets. Women are always overdosed on pellets. They feel good for a little while. And then after that, then they just feel horrible. And once you put it in, it stays for 3 months. You can't do anything about it if the dose is wrong. And there's no flexibility there. Now, there are some women, it's becoming more popular to do injections of hormones, injectable estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. You can do it. It is a little bit more difficult to manage, difficult to dose sometimes. And they're all injections, and the progesterone and testosterone are in a thick oil. So it's much more uncomfortable when you do it that way. We can also support the hormones with BPC 157 for gut repair. And if there's sexual dysfunction issues or decreased libido, there's a peptide we can use called PT 141 that helps restore the sexual function, whether it's male or female based, and it's just injected as needed. And then, of course, if there's really big issues with detox, we're going to use IV glutathione to detox heavy metals and chemicals and estrogen. We can do Myers cocktails for nutrient repletion and mitochondrial repair. And then we can also do NAD IVs or NAD nasal sprays these days to help rebuild the mitochondria and balance those hormones and give your body the cofactors that it needs to make the hormones better or more efficient. And so if we look at just another moment to reflect here, which is the layer of healing that you think you might be missing? Is it you've never tested beyond basic labs, or I need to know if my gut's working properly? Maybe it's stress. Maybe from the previous time that we reflected, you realized like, gosh, I have more stress than I know what to do with, but I really don't know how to change it. And that's something that we want to address. And if you're on hormones, but you still don't feel right, then we have to go back and look at some of these other areas that may have been missed and try to find the cofactors to build those hormones exactly the way you want them to be built so that you can feel the best that you possibly can. And so there's 5 actions I want you to take this week. First is track your stress biology. You can download an HRV app, the HeartMath or the Elite HRV. Monitor your heart rate variability. That's what HRV stands for. And the reading gives you a cortisol proxy. So low HRV high stress burden. Sometimes you can do this with an aura ring too. You can see your stress levels there as well.
It up. I'm listening to dynamic.
A- And then start supporting your estrogen detox pathways. So if you're not consuming cruciferous vegetables and you like them, try to consume 1 to 2 cups of broccoli, cauliflower, and kale on a daily basis. And this will provide you enough of the active ingredient in the cruciferous compounds called indole carbonol 3 to help pull out those excess estrogens. And you can get indole carbonol 3, it's called IC3, or you can get DIM as the precursor to do this for you if you don't really care for the cruciferous vegetables or really have a hard time eating them on a daily basis, which it's kind of tough to do that. And then check your toxic load. Ditch all your plastic food containers, get rid of all your soft plastic water bottles, switch over to glass or stainless, stop using synthetic fragrances and air fresheners and the dryer sheets. These are all xenoestrogen sources. Go to more natural things like essential oils. Use those things instead if you want to create a nice fragrance. Support your gut every day with probiotics like lactobacillus, reuteri, rasmosis. Aim for 30 different plant foods per week. Give your body really good gut diversity. This can really be helpful for that leaky gut. And then request better testing. If you haven't already had a full sex hormone panel with SHBG, 4-point cortisol, urine estrogen metabolites, micronutrient panels, C reactive protein, fasting insulin, and ferritin, and not just a TSH, but a full thyroid workup, request those things because those are really important for us to know and have information for. And then if you're ready to look at your hormones at a deeper level, you can take one of our hormone quizzes. We have them free online at serenityhealthcarecenter.com. You can download the free assessment and it'll give you an idea of where you are with hormones, whether it's female hormones, male hormones, thyroid, or adrenal. And then if you're interested in working with us, you can work with us as well. If you're already a client of ours and you haven't had hormones done, you can call and talk to your practitioner and message and ask them to do that for you as well.